My name is Kerri Richardson-Redding. I was born Kerri Richardson. And my relationship to Walter Reed is that I grew up in the neighborhood. I grew up on Underwood Street between 13th and 14th. And my family moved into that house right before my 5th birthday in 1974. And I lived in that house until I went away to college. My mother still lives in that house on Underwood Street. And when I moved back to the Washington, D.C. area about 10 years ago, I chose specifically to live in this neighborhood, in the neighborhood I grew up in. So now I live on the opposite side of Georgia Avenue from Walter Reed. But we've been watching the construction and the renovation of the property since I arrived. And since the space was vacated, my entire family is here in the D.C. area. And have watched and wondered what's going to happen. We had all sorts of predictions, et cetera, and so on. And so growing up in the neighborhood, my brother and I rode our bikes, and a lot of the neighborhood kids, Walter Reed was part of our play space. We had a radius of how far we could go. And the border was, you could go to the Walter Reed property, but you had to stay on the Alaska Avenue side. You couldn't cross the street and come back around. And so that's my relationship. Yeah. Back then, it was the gate primarily on 16th Street that had access, and we would just ride in. Sometimes we got stopped, but usually we were known. We were a known quantity of neighborhood kids, and there's probably about 10 of us on bikes that got together regularly. My family's house was the gathering place for kids on my block and in my neighborhood, and so we'd meet up there, and then we'd ride around through Walter Reed and then go down into the park off 16th Street, come back around through the golf course. But this was our play area. This was a lovely, quiet, safe neighborhood to grow up in. And when my family moved here, we bought our house from the Helfensteins. And I will never forget this because Mr. Helfenstein walked us through the house and explained how he raised his family there and why they were excited that our family was moving in as a young family. And he explained, raising his children. And I remember when my parents let us choose our bedroom, I chose the same bedroom that his daughter had chosen many, many years ago. And so the neighborhood was turning over from primarily a Jewish neighborhood to an African-American middle-class neighborhood in the early 70s.
So what did you say you were 5?
It was right before my 5th birthday, yeah.
So were you allowed to come over to Walter Reed then? Or were
No, the boundaries got larger as you got older. And so first it was contained to our block, and Underwood Street, it's Underwood and then Van Buren and then Fort Stevens Playground right there. And so by the time I was 8 or so on my bikes, we could go to Fort Stevens Playground on our own because my parents knew all of the families with children in our contained block. And in the 70s, it was still the time when your parents told you to come in by the time the streetlights came on. And mothers would still stand on the back porch and holler. And you could hear, it was sort of a chain. And it was like, well, if David got called, we got to go too. And then you'd all ride home. And so throughout late elementary school, middle school, high school, definitely open. And there were times when it was closed around security things because we used to be able to drive through, especially all the way through from Georgia to 16th. And then there were times it was closed. But I guess my most seminal memory is my Sweet 16 party, which we had at the Officers Club here at Walter Reed.
So how did that come about? And how were you allowed to have it here?
Yeah, my mom and my dad were both first-generation college and tried to do for my brother and I all of the middle-class things. And for my mother, that also meant debutante. And I was an athlete. And so there was a lot of mother-daughter tension around that. And we settled on a Sweet 16 party as opposed to me going to the whole debutante white dress ceremony. And then we had to find a place for it. And so we were part of a big church down on 16th Street, and we looked at the church basement first. But then my parents were going to have a parent party that was adjacent to the teen party, and there was going to be alcohol, so the church wasn't a good place. My dad was in the Army, and so he was in the reserves at that time, and through his relationship with the military, we were able to get access to the club. I remember coming over because my dad and I walked from our house to look at it. Like on the day we had to meet with the manager about what it would be and what the spaces were. And my father wanted me to understand what a big deal this was at the Officers Club. And that's how it came to be. So I remember at that time, I went to a private school on the other side of the city, and most of my peers from the school were much more affluent than my own family. So it was also a big deal in that we were able to do this for me at 16, and all of those friends and families came to drop off at the officers club. I can remember standing out front as people's cars pulled up and they had to check in at the gate. They came in through 16th Street and they had to check in at the gate. We had to give them a list, of who was going to be there. And then there was the teen party was in like this ballroom area. And then there was this separate room where the adults were, and there was a bar. And I remember because they put up ropes like at a movie theater where the teenagers could not go onto that side of the club. And the dads, sort of held the line because we were teenagers.
So this debutante thing, is your mother from DC?
No, my mom's actually from North Carolina by way of Long Island. But for Black families becoming middle class at that time, there were certain markers of middle class life. And one of those was a house. So moving into this house was a big deal for us. We lived in an apartment building in Southwest prior to this. So having a house, having a picket fence, we actually still have a picket fence, a wooden picket fence in the backyard. We had dogs, you had the 2 kids and the dog. I grew up with beagles in our backyard that we often walked. When we took the dog for a walk, you'd walk up 13th Street to Walter Reed. If you could get in, you'd go through. If you couldn't get in, you'd go around. But there was that beautiful walking path on the 16th Street side that was often open to the community. So you could come into 16th Street and walk around that path that way and then come back out. Yeah, inside the gate. Sometimes there were deer that got caught inside, right? They would wander in during the day and they'd close the gate and then there were deer. But yeah, it was just one of the markers of middle class life, being able to do this, to have some sort of ceremony for growing up. And I'm the oldest, so I was the first one. Boys didn't do that in the same way. My brother didn't have to do that.
Not a debutante party.
Yeah, no, for sure.
16, right? So what was the party like?
It was quite big. I tried to find the photo album before I came, but it's buried in my mother's basement somewhere. But we had a professional photographer come, and there was a balloon arch of pink and gray heart balloons because there was a photo station under there with a professional photographer. And that was a big deal too. My parents don't have a lot of pictures of themselves growing up. I've never seen a picture of my mother below the age of 14. And so documenting all parts of our life was really important. I remember it was probably about 50 plus because it felt really big in terms of my friends. The dance floor felt full. We had a DJ, with all of the 80s music. And I remember the adults were having a great time. I was raised in a community where I knew all of my parents' friends as, aunts and uncles, and they were all professionals, doctors, lawyers, judges here in DC. So it felt swanky at that time. And I remember it was a big tension between dressing up formally versus dressing for a teenage party. And so there was a lot of concessions made there. We were there, I think it was like 8 to midnight, because I remember some of my friends went off and then we're going to go party on, continue partying, and I wanted to go too. And my parents were like, nope, as the hostess, we have responsibilities, in terms of cleaning up and putting the club back together. I was very upset by that, but it was a lovely event. And at that time in DC, when I left DC and I moved to other places, people were always surprised when I talked about having an integrated upbringing, and that I've always been in situations where there have been different people of different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, racial backgrounds. So at that time, having that party here and having so many people of different backgrounds in that space, a lot of the adults were surprised by the diversity of my friend group. My friends, this was normal for us, but our parents didn't socialize in the same way. So I realized it was awkward for some of them. It's like, this is my friend's parents, and but there was a lot of differentiation in social classes and then just a broad swath of racial and ethnic identities.
What school did you go to?
At that time, I had just left National Cathedral School for Girls and had transferred to Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, okay. So you had friends from both places?
I had friends from Woodrow Wilson, from National Cathedral, and then from the neighborhood as well. Yeah.
So I'm assuming your parents' friends, the adult party was mostly Black?
No, it was friends of my current...
Oh, it was diverse too?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The friends were were surprised.
Yeah. So, like I said, at some point, if I can produce pictures, I'd happily share those for the project.
Okay, well,
because it really shows.
When you find them, that would be great.
Yeah, it really shows the diversity of that time. And I remember it being such a big deal because I was in an interracial dating relationship, and my boyfriend at the time was Jewish. And when the photographer came to take pictures, like he took pictures of the grouping as a party, and then there was pictures taken of me by myself at 16. And he said, do you have some people, do you want to be in the picture? And my boyfriend was standing right next to me, but the photographer kept looking around the room for someone else. And I was like, no, that's the guy right there. And so I remember the photographer was way more awkward than we were about it. Because at that time, I think we'd already been dating a year or something. Like we were established and people knew that we were a couple. And yeah, but it was, I think, part of the changing demographics of America and being here in DC, because there's such an international population here and military population moving in and out. Those of us who grew up here, we got to experience all of that as normal.
Right. Was this 86?
Yeah, it was about 86, yep.
And when you said concessions about the, dress, you mean like, what were the concessions? What the guests were allowed to wear, or what you got to wear or had to wear or whatever?
We had an invitation printed, which was a big deal that I remember hand addressing and mailing to everyone, right, back in that day. And it was what to put on the invitation in terms of what to wear. And my definition of party casual at 16 was very different than my parents' definition of party casual. And so I wasn't even allowed to wear pants to my own 16th. I had to wear, I'll never forget this particular dress that I don't think I ever wore again, but it skirted the line between acceptable to my mom and still cool enough that I could wear it at 16. And it didn't look like a church dress, which was the big important thing. So,
what did it look like?
Around that time, the wrap dress was becoming really popular. And so it was a version of a wrap dress that had pockets. Right? Pockets are always a thing in women's clothing, but in 86, to have a dress for myself that had pockets and it snapped all the way down the front, and it was kind of that like Banana Republic military brown-green color that I could pop the collar on. I remember the collar was really important, and the belt was ginormous.
I can picture it.
Yeah, ginormous. Yeah, yeah.
Do you come to the base for movies and things?
There were some community events that we came to, but for us, it was mostly an extension of the neighborhood in many ways. My father, like I said, he was in the military, and there were some meetings here for blacks in the military or blacks in government that he would come to in the evenings. But only when they were really big community events, because even then, there was a little bit of a disconnect between those of us who lived in the neighborhood and those that worked here or were part of the interior of this community every day.
So he wasn't involved in the UBAD issue, which was
no
employees here.
No.
So blacks in government is just like a citywide thing, or
yes, yeah. And at that time, my father worked at the Department of Justice. He was a lawyer, and so that was his involvement.
And they actually gave space for these community meetings?
I don't know if it was a giving space. I know that my father worked downtown, and then he took public transportation down to the office. And so he would come home and then say he was going to a meeting and take the car and go up the road for the meeting, but not walking up to the meeting.
But it was here?
It was here at Walter Reed, yeah.
What other ways did you interact with Walter Reed?
Well, as a younger person, even though we had a boundary we were supposed to stay inside of, my brother and I, when it was just the two of us, would often ride our bikes up and then spend time at the museum here. And I don't remember it being like a museum the way I visit museums today. I do remember the building was always open. There weren't a lot of adults around. And when they were around, they sort of didn't pay attention to us kids. And there were all of these medical specimens in jars, and that was the most fascinating thing for us, to read about those and what they were doing and why they were doing it. My brother and I were very curious kids, and we were also, being the children of a lawyer and a teacher, we were well-mannered. And so the times when we did get asked what we were doing, hi, my name is Kerri. This is my brother Patrick. We live in the neighborhood. We just came by. We had a whole preparation to explain who we were. And the guards at the 16th Street gate in particular got to know us enough that we would ride up and they were like, not today. There's some things going on. Maybe it's not a good idea. You all should go on home. Or there was one time where we brought friends and they did not behave as well. And I just remember my dad had to come up to get us. Yeah.
In the museum or on the grounds?
We were at the museum. And I remember because we ended up sitting outside the museum with a guard. And it wasn't us, it was the people we brought with us, and my father was very clear about, it wasn't you all, and and explaining to the other people, Kerri and Patrick do this all the time. They don't usually get in trouble. Let's be more careful about this. And the guard was there. The guard we knew that was there and was like, this is what happened. So yeah, but one of the most fun things to do was to zoom in on your bike, go around that fountain as many times as you could when there were no cars there on your bike.
The penguin fountain?
Yes, and then zoom back out. That was a race, 3 times around the fountain and then come back out. And as children, there were times that I can say I was barefoot in that fountain. It was hot in DC in the summer.
The statute of limitations has run out.
Okay, we're good. Okay.
Did they, yell at you for going in there, or?
No, we were there with our bikes. We didn't stay long. And at that time, there were more families here. We would see kids with parents or what looked like in groups, not our groups, but there was a culture that children were on the base. And so as long as we were well behaved, no one really told us we couldn't be here.
Who were those kids? Were they neighbors, or was there a daycare or something?
I don't know if it was a daycare. I do remember at one time my brother befriended someone who was a sibling of someone who was here at a hospital, because we kept seeing this little boy. Often enough, he wasn't from the neighborhood. My brother was very friendly, and we were over in the area where the walking path was, and he would sit on a bench in the afternoons and read. And being kids at some point.
Your brother or this other kid?
This young man. And at some point, my brother, went up to him and said, do you want to play with us? And that's when we found out he wasn't from here, but his family was staying here because he had a family member in the hospital. And so he was here maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
Did you play in the Rose Garden? Was that on the kids circuit?
No, we weren't.
Wasn't inviting for kids.
Not inviting for kids, no. And anything that looked manicured and taken care of, we knew to stay away from, because that would draw attention to us.
But could you just ride all over the place?
Pretty much. The hospital was more of an off-limits area, especially the front of the hospital, because it was really busy. And sometimes, living in DC, when official cars are moving, you learn to spot what that is. And so there were times when there'd be more police activity in the neighborhood, and you knew somebody official was coming this way or somebody official was here. And the news cycle was different. So you always found out about afterwards, that this important person had been at the Walter Reed campus. But we knew because the neighborhood changed a little bit in terms of security.
Did that mean you didn't come in?
Yes.
Would they have stopped you?
I know my parents often said, don't go. Like when there was activity, please stay closer to home sometimes. And then there were times where the gates were closed and they asked for ID. And those times we'd turn around. Yeah.
What did you notice, maybe you weren't around then, but when Desert Storm and times like that, that a lot of helicopter activity and a lot of other kind of activity?
My family talked about that. When I left for college, I didn't move back until about 10 years ago. And so my family did talk about the helicopter traffic in the neighborhood in particular. And then I don't know what the change was, but there was a big change in terms of there was more personnel in the neighborhood because parking became a huge issue, because people were parking as far away as Underwood Street in Tewksbury, which is 3 and 4 blocks south.
To work here. Yes,
they would park their cars and then they would walk up. And then sometimes there was neighborhood reports of less than desirable behavior of people in cars in the neighborhood that were associated with Walter Reed in some way, which I know led to the parking that we have now, that you need a sticker. I remember that was a shock. It was like, what do you mean I need a sticker to park here? But that became a thing because the parking got really bad for a while. And you'd see these droves of people walking out of the neighborhood up 13th Street toward Walter Reed at that time. Yeah.
Let's see. Can you think of something I need to ask you?
Something you need to ask me.
Something I should have asked you. Stories you have.
Yeah, no, I would say, Walter Reed is a fixture up here. And for a long time growing up in DC in this neighborhood, it felt like a hidden gem because so much attention was focused either downtown or on the other side of the park in particular. But over here was like the undiscovered country. of DC, and that it was quiet, it was family centered, being here in Manor Park, Brightwood, and adjacent to Tacoma. My brother and I walked throughout this area, and I can remember walking from our house here up toward Tacoma Co-op, or going to the metro station from school and then coming back, going through Walter Reed the long way around, because it took another 20 minutes to walk across the campus and come up the 16th Street side, as opposed to just coming down George Avenue for the bus route in that way. I think everybody in the neighborhood, regardless of what side of Walter Reed we were on, had some relationship with the campus in some way. And I can remember meeting friends in the middle who were in Shepherd Park, whose families also had the similar boundary. You could get to Walter Reed but not go beyond, and so we'd just meet in the middle.
But do you feel that maybe it's a hidden gem, but if it had been a discovered gem, maybe they would have closed it off and not have so many,
Perhaps.
people
I think when it was announced that they were moving right from here to the NIH and renaming and all of that, and then the campus stayed vacant for a while, I know that my mother and my brother in particular attended a lot of meetings in the neighborhood about what was going to be done with the space and could we use the space. The big fear was that it was going to be housing that was developed and that would outprice and outpace the rest of the neighborhood. And so as the plans have developed over the past couple of years, it's been nice that there's some housing and there's other community projects happening at the same time. And the cultural program that's happening, right, with the jazz in the summer, and has been really inviting to keep people connected to the space in some way and not feel like outsiders, which has been really helpful.
And the fact that most of the buildings are remaining. I can imagine what the fear of everything being torn down and then just like it never was here, never existed would be upsetting.
I don't remember what building it was in. There was a building that had the Olympic pool in it. Or was it Aquatic Center? Okay. I remember being taken around one of those times we came in where we weren't really supposed to be here, and someone said, "Do you want to see some other buildings?" We were like, "Sure." And I remember I had never seen that before. After feeling familiar and understanding where the officers' mansions were, where the hospital was, understanding some of the landmarks, not knowing there was an Olympic-sized pool over there. And that it was only available to people here on the facility, right? Because those of us in the neighborhood had to go to Tacoma, right, to the pool. Or
right. I know it was there. And
it
was north, but you couldn't have used it.
No, we couldn't have used it. Yeah. We couldn't have used it.
And the same maybe for the movie theater. Maybe you had to be employed here or be the family of...
Yeah, we never came. I don't have any recollection of that. I remember I know they call it the Exchange now, but I think it was the PX back then. And I remember coming with my father for some times to the PX, but usually went to Fort McNair because that's where he was stationed. Yeah, I'm thinking of other things.
Okay, what schools did you go to for elementary? And then did those kids have the same relationship?
I went to Lafayette Elementary School, and my brother and I went to Lafayette because the schools in this neighborhood didn't offer aftercare programs at that time.
Oh, and so that's out of boundary for...
Oh, it's out of boundary. My parents had to do a lot to get us in there. But if you couldn't get in over here at Shepherd, Lafayette was the next in terms of aftercare programs and other programs. And then I went to National Cathedral School for Girls. My brother went to St. John's when it was still an all-boys school. And then we both graduated from Woodrow Wilson Senior High School at that time. The kids over here, if you lived within 3 or 4 blocks in terms of your play, this was definitely something that you interacted with. But beyond that, not so much. And especially if your parents didn't have a relationship to the military. I know my brother and I felt more comfortable than other kids in the neighborhood because our father was in the military. And we had been on bases, and we understood that life in a way that the other kids didn't. They were especially official, like they were just more hands off. And we were like, it's totally fine. And my father is the type of person that I just installed a flagpole for him in his apartment this past week because he didn't have a way to put up his flag. And so we grew up putting up a flag on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. And he has a lot of national pride around his military service. And all the men in our family, going back 3 generations, have military service in some way.
Did other people, did the neighbors put up flags?
Those that were military affiliated, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And like I said, as this neighborhood turned over from a Jewish neighborhood to an African-American middle-class neighborhood, the way the blocks are in that area, you have single-family homes in the middle of the block, and then you have these apartment buildings all along 13th Street. And so there was a bit of a socioeconomic divide there. And my father was the type of person whoever showed up at our house, he was their dad. And I can think of a lot of friends I had growing up for whom my dad was their dad in that way, and talked about his own journey in life and his military service. And I can think of 2 or 3 young men who went into the military at my father's urging, because college wasn't going to be a good option for them in terms of finding a way to be successful in the world. And so,
Was going to Lafayette, that must have been, that's too far from here to, or were there other kids from the neighborhood who went there?
yeah, and we all took the bus. We took the E4 bus. Usually a parent would drop you off right at 16th, where the bus goes across on Military Road. And then the same thing, you'd get off the bus at the end of the day and you'd be on 16th at that bus stop, and we'd all walk through the neighborhood, saying bye to your friends on the way. We were not the furthest walkers. The furthest walkers were on the other side of Walter Reed. But it was way more fun to walk and talk with your friends than to ride the bus
Sure.
in the afternoon. Yeah. So yeah.
And you weren't like a stranger in a strange land at Lafayette if other kids from the neighborhood were.
There were enough. Yeah, there were enough. Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of other Walter Reed related things around that. I can't think of any. And I did ask all of my family too, as I'm going to do this thing, is there anything you really want me to say or not say or remembering? And my father, again, just said how much he appreciated being close to Walter Reed and that sort of reinforcement of pride, military pride and culture in that way.
Just because it was a military establishment, not because you didn't get any health care here or anything like that, right?
No, he didn't. But it was cultural, that the choices that he made in life were also reinforced by this being here. And yeah.
Did it feel secure, more secure?
Yeah, it did. It did. There were a lot of people walking around in uniform, even though they're not police or anything like that, but there was a sense of civic duty. And these are all people who've chosen to spend their lives in civic service in some way. And that's a different way of being in the world. And that was the way that my parents wanted us to be in the world. And so,
I mean, it's partially, obviously, psychological, but also, I mean, literally, presumably, is more secure with a military establishment right here. Yeah. Or maybe it's less secure if it gets bombed. But anyway.
Well, in that way, yes. That was
just the idea of.
But the idea, yeah. And then it did create unusual traffic patterns in the neighborhood, because as people were commuting in, there were a lot more people moving into the neighborhood than actually lived here. And I can remember after traditional rush hour, like after 6:30 or so, you just had to be more cautious because there were less people on the street. But there was a whole commerce around Walter Reed, the businesses on Georgia Avenue, and then seeing people in Safeway all the time. There was a commerce around that, and that they were neighbors, which was nice.
The Safeway down on Piney Branch and
Georgia and Piney Branch. Yep.
Has any? I guess that's changed because with the base gone. I mean, there's new people here, or there will be.
Yes, and in the 10 years I've been here, that Safeway's been renovated 3 times, and it's all in competition with everything else around. Especially when Whole Foods landed in Silver Spring quite some time ago, and now that we'll have a newer supermarket over here, we're all very excited about that.
Yeah. So actually, you're all looking forward to, or you are anyway, looking forward to the changes. Are you gonna like miss the old Walter Reed more than you welcome the new, the parks of Walter Reed, or is it kind of even out? Or
well, we won't know really, I think, until development's finished, but it feels like it's bringing a lot more people to this area of the city, and there's challenges around that, especially for those who are used to living in a quiet neighborhood, and this was an affordable neighborhood in many ways for a long time. But with all of the promise of development, especially going north on Georgia Avenue, it's changed a lot in the neighborhood. And there's been a lot of changes on 16th Street, northern 16th Street, and then this business corridor on Georgia Avenue has changed. And when when the population left, the businesses suffered and changed as well. And they're still in the process of coming back or changing, but there's been real inconsistency, especially from Walter Reed down until about Kennedy Street. There's been real inconsistency in the George Avenue businesses that used to be more supported by the population that was here.
And I think, I mean, obviously all of DC is gentrifying and
Yes.
prices have gone up. And I know the Great Streets program
Yep.
was underway before,
Yeah.
I suppose it was underway when the closure was announced, but it was definitely underway by the time the move occurred. So some
Yeah.
of those things were happening.
Simultaneously, yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of the traffic patterns have changed in the neighborhood as well, which is a little unsettling. We understand why, and we can see where the movement's coming. But for those of us for whom this is local, it makes some things harder.
Yeah, and those are also changing around the city because there's
Absolutely.
like different
Yeah,
priorities or whatever, or different DDOT
yeah,
personnel, whatever,
yeah. I can remember when Reagan came here. That was a big deal.
to visit or to be.
No, he was receiving some medical care. And it was a big deal because, of course, Secret Service was here and there was increased security in the neighborhood. But also having Secret Service cars in the neighborhood felt unsettling. It felt like we were being watched in a different way, especially because the playground is so close, right? The playground and then 2 blocks you're here, and the way that they patrolled the neighborhood. I do remember the heightened security around that time.
Oh, did they use those? What were those vehicles they used? The Secret Service under Reagan used to use these Broncos, I think they were.
I just remember they had tinted windows and it felt like you were being watched. Because they were patrolling also. They were, it's like the 3rd time that cars come around the block. And the neighborhood was quiet enough that neighbors talked to one another. We knew each other's cars. And I can remember my mom saying, they're here. And she knew the schedule. Like she was that observant.
Of the rounds they
Yeah.
made?
Because from our house, you could see both the front of our house and then on Underwood Street, we're right against a apartment building. So from our backyard, you can see through to the park. So you could actually monitor traffic on 3 streets at the same time from our kitchen. So, so the old school neighborhood watched for sure.